we're not only going to mention the muscle, but also how sleep and stress can play a part of helping ensure that you have healthy metabolism. And remember, I want you to pay attention, not because I'm going to have a quiz, but because you need to learn this material well enough that you can go and teach someone else. So if you aren't yet, get off your phones and take notes. It's time to learn. Now, how bad is the metabolic problem in Asia? Up to half of all adults through East and Southeast Asia have diabetes or pre-diabetes. So this is a problem that is the most common health problem in this part of the world. Half of all the adults you know will have a metabolic issue. And in fact, it's a little worse in Asia than it even is in North America. Where Dr. Reynolds and I are coming from at our university, if you look at the levels of glucose in a Caucasian population versus an Asian population, we see in the Caucasian group that glucose levels are generally in a normal range. They're somewhere in the 80s, mid to high 80s. And this is a normal number. However, if you look at the same glucose levels in an Asian adult population, then all of a sudden we see that the glucose levels are several points higher. So there is a glucose problem in Asia that is worse than it is in Western Europe and North America, in Caucasian populations. Now, you will have a friend who will say, why? Remember, you teach this idea. You teach the idea that we have a glucose or a metabolic problem here, and it's worse here than in other parts of the world. Now, in the time we have together this morning, I want you to take away two very important lessons. One, I want you to appreciate why this matters. Why is it important to control your glucose? Why is it important to not have glucose levels going so high all the time? That's number one. Now, number two is why does this happen? And then within that is some solution. So why does it matter and why does it happen? These are 2 points I want to make sure you understand. Let's start with why should your friends be worried about their glucose levels? One problem among many is that glucose is sticky. Imagine it acting like honey in your body, where just like honey is very sticky if you get it on your fingers, glucose can be very sticky when it starts to connect with other parts of your body like proteins or different types of fats and all kinds of different molecules. We call these things, when they bind and it will damage the protein, these are called glycation products. Or we can just say that a molecule like a protein will get glycated. This is the process of glycation. This is actually something that Dr. Reynolds studies a lot, and we have published several papers on this topic. So it's funny for me to be talking about glycation when he is an expert on glycation. But remember, this is why it matters. When you teach your friends that here in Asia, adults have higher glucose levels than Caucasians do, they may say, well, so what? It matters, because let's look at what happens if the brain undergoes glycation, or the heart can undergo glycation, the kidneys can undergo glycation, and even our skeletals, our bones. Now, in the brain, if you have too much glucose in the brain, that can increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease. I think everyone here is a little bit afraid of Alzheimer's disease. Now, what about the heart? When the heart undergoes glycation, it can make the muscle of the heart start to fail. So you increase the risk of heart failure. And the kidneys, when they undergo glycation because the glucose levels are so high, that is the leading cause of kidney failure in adults. Too high of blood glucose. And then even our bones can undergo glycation, where the glucose will stick to the bones like sticky honey, and it will start to erode the bones, causing osteoarthritis or a weakening of the bone mass within the body. Now, we don't measure these things in a clinic. You can't go in and have your brain measured for glycation or your bones. And so what we will do in a clinic is measure the degree to which your red blood cells have undergone glycation. Within the red blood cell is a molecule called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is what will carry oxygen through your blood. Every time you breathe and you take oxygen in, it's the hemoglobin on our red blood cells that will move the oxygen through the body. But when hemoglobin undergoes glycation, because the glucose levels are so high, then it doesn't carry oxygen very well. The oxygen gets kicked off. So we can't move oxygen well, our red blood cells aren't working very well. But this is something that can be measured. When we measure this, we call it hemoglobin A1C, or just HbA1c. Does that look familiar? You've probably had this measured before on a blood test. Sometimes it's just A1C. Now you know what it is. A1C is a marker of glycation in your body because we can easily measure the blood. Like I said, you can't take a biopsy of your brain or a biopsy of your bone and measure the glycation there. And so in order to understand the glycation level, we measure someone's blood. And here's a general category or a cutoff where we typically will say a person has diabetes if their A1C level gets up to about 6.5%. Now, if high glucose levels are a problem in Asia more than other parts of the world, how do A1C levels compare between Caucasian and Asian populations? Who would have a higher glycation level? Of course, the Asian adults do. So there is a unique metabolic problem that affects Asian adults more than other adults. You need to remember this and teach it to your friends. Okay, so now you know why it matters. That as blood glucose levels are too high, glycation is happening more, and where there is more glycation, there is tissue damage. All right, now, how does this happen? Why is it that an Asian adult experiences higher glucose levels than, say, a Caucasian adult? This is another important point. There are very compelling studies in human adults that have shown just how bad this problem is. So here's one study I want to share with you. If you have a Caucasian adult and an Asian adult, and you give them both the exact same amount of sugar, naturally their blood glucose levels will go up. But in the Asian, it will go up more than twice as high as it goes up in the Caucasian. So in the Asian body, that glucose level will go up 2 times higher in the blood than it will in the Caucasian, even if they're the exact same body. Imagine 2 Dr. Bickmans. One here, Caucasian Dr. Bickman with bald hair and freckles, and then imagine Asian version of Dr. Bickman with nice, beautiful black hair and no freckles. That sounds better. But Asian version of Dr. Bickman, if we both drink sugar, Asian Dr. Bickman will go 2 times higher on blood glucose. That is a huge difference, even in an identical body. One of the big differences is muscle mass. Muscle matters, and also the other principle I want to teach you is sleep deprivation. These, I believe, are 2 of the big problems that can explain why an Asian adult will have blood glucose levels that go so much higher. Let's start with muscle mass. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this because Dr. Reynolds already did a wonderful job teaching you the principles. But I just want you to understand why the problem might be worse in Asia than in other parts of the world. I want to share with you a study that was just published a few years ago. They looked at the amount of muscle mass in adults around the world, and they found that Asian adults tended to have the lowest amount of muscle mass among all of the ethnicities they measured. Remember, that matters because where does glucose go? When we drink or eat a bunch of sugar or a bunch of starches from bread or rice or cereal, we take in the glucose and then we see our blood glucose levels go up. But then how does the blood glucose level go down? Of course, it's because the muscle is very hungry. It's like a demanding little child who keeps wanting more and more, and the blood glucose will go into the muscle. 80% of the glucose when we take in carbohydrates will go into our muscle. So if we don't have as much muscle, there's just less place for the glucose to go. And so the glucose will linger in the blood. And if we have less muscle, glucose levels will be much, much higher. Now let me just show you this in a slightly different perspective. I need you to understand that in order to have good glucose control, we need muscle. Muscle will take in the glucose, which will then allow the insulin hormone to be lower and go down. But of course, if we have less muscle, that means we can't move the glucose in. And so blood glucose will be much higher. And if blood glucose is high because the muscle isn't sufficient to take it in, then the insulin will be higher as well. So I will say it again. If you know someone who is worried about their glucose levels, you tell them you need to be worried about your muscle. We need more muscle in order to control blood glucose levels. Now, what can you do about it? This is what Dr. Reynolds already spoke about. If we have lower muscle mass, we need more muscle mass. Of course, that means you have to exercise, but you can also help the hungry muscle with superior protein, with superior amino acids, and leucine and HMB, and then of course creatine as well. And Dr. Reynolds already taught you Stronghold has been specifically designed to help with muscle mass. So as you talk to your friend and you tell them, they may share with you, my blood glucose or my blood sugar levels are high. You say, what are you doing to help your muscles be big and strong? Because big, strong muscles are hungry muscles, and they want to eat more blood glucose. Okay, so that's one problem that is unique to Asian adults. We need to try to increase muscle mass. But there's a second problem, and some of you are not going to be happy hearing me tell you this, and that is sleep deprivation. If a human body is not getting enough sleep, then they experience a significant increase in the most famous of all stress hormones, and that hormone is cortisol. So if you have too little sleep, you have more stress, and cortisol will be up a lot. And one thing that cortisol does very, very well is it increases blood glucose. In fact, cortisol will strip the proteins from your muscle and send it to the liver to tell your liver to make more blood glucose. Cortisol will destroy your muscle in order to increase blood glucose levels. Now I want to scare you a little bit, just so you appreciate how bad this problem is. There was a paper published by a very good university here in Korea, and they found that if you had an adult in Korea who got less than 7 hours of sleep per night, their fasted glucose levels the next day were 48% higher. Do some of you get less than 7 hours of sleep a night? I bet you do. I bet most of you do not get 7 hours. But that's what was so important. They found that 7 hours was the cutoff. If you were getting less than 7, your blood glucose levels are going to be 50% higher the next day. That should scare you a little bit. Now, you might be thinking, well, Dr. Bickman, that's not fair. Everybody in the whole world sleeps so poorly these days. Why should you be upset with us here in the Asia Pacific.
Chúc bộ đội lâu nay ngủ mấy tiếng.
Well, it's because it's worse here than anywhere else. There was a paper just published
Người Hàn người ta chỉ ngủ 4-5
that
tiếng.
actually documented sleep habits around
Nên
the
người Hàn mới tự tử nhiều đó.
And they found that some areas of the world, in some countries, would get more or less sleep than others.
Kìa, nhìn kìa. Thái Lan, Hồng Kông, Ấn Độ, Singapore, Hàn Quốc, Nhật Bản là ngủ ít kìa. Châu Á kìa. Ôi ôi.
Asia, on average, adults in Asia will get less sleep than anywhere else in the world. Anywhere else. So I am with you all now, and I feel your pain because I'm a terrible sleeper, but you are not getting enough sleep. And remember, when we don't get enough sleep, cortisol levels will be higher. So your
Cái này
friend
đi về phải
tells
ngủ
you,
cho thực
I'm
tế
worried
mới được.
about my blood glucose levels. And you say, you already talked to them about muscle. And they said, okay, I'm trying to improve my muscle. What else can I do? You need to improve your sleep. But they want to know how. And thankfully, you will teach them how and give them some solutions. First of all, I want you to teach them about L-theanine. That's a mouthful. That's an awkward word. So good luck saying that word. L-theanine. There was a paper just published that found that just taking L-theanine was sufficient to improve every single part of sleep. People were able to fall asleep faster. They were able to sleep more deeply and longer. And they had what is commonly called better sleep architecture. They were going in and out of all of their sleep cycles very, very well. Now, L-theanine actually works better when it is coupled with magnesium.